It was a chilly autumn night in October when I found myself driving along the winding stretch of Highway 30 in Oregon. I'd been on the road for hours, making my way from Portland to Astoria. The clock on my dashboard read 11:43 p.m., and I was starting to feel the fatigue creeping in. My eyes were heavy, and I'd already downed 3 cups of gas station coffee in a futile attempt to stay alert. The rain had been relentless since I left Portland, but now it was coming down in sheets. My wipers were working overtime, and even then I could barely see more than a few feet ahead of me. The darkness seemed to press in from all sides, broken only by the occasional flash of my headlights reflecting off the wet road signs. The rhythmic thud of the wipers and the constant patter of rain on the roof were hypnotic, making it even harder to stay focused on the road. I was considering pulling over to wait out the storm when I saw a figure by the roadside. At first, I thought my tired eyes were playing tricks on me, but as I got closer, I realized it was a person. A hitchhiker, standing there in the pouring rain. The sight was so unexpected that I nearly swerved off the road in surprise. My first instinct was to keep driving. I mean, who picks up hitchhikers these days, right? Especially on a night like this in the middle of nowhere. Every horror movie I'd ever seen flashed through my mind, warning me of the dangers of stopping for strangers. But something made me slow down. Maybe it was the way they were hunched against the rain. Or maybe it was just that I couldn't bear the thought of leaving someone out there in this weather. Whatever it was, I found myself pulling over to the side of the road, my tires crunching on the wet gravel of the shoulder. As I rolled down my window, the sound of the rain intensified, drumming against the car like 1,000 tiny fists. I got a better look at the hitchhiker. It was hard to make out much in the darkness and rain, but I could see it was a young woman, probably in her early 20s. She was absolutely drenched, her dark hair plastered to her face, and she was shivering visibly. Her clothes, a simple t-shirt and jeans, were soaked through, clinging to her frame. She looked small and vulnerable standing there in the storm, and any reservations I had about picking her up melted away. I called out to her, asking if she needed a ride. My voice sounded strange and muffled in the cocoon of the car, barely audible over the rain. She nodded quickly and hurried over to the passenger side. As she opened the door, a gust of cold, wet air rushed in, along with a stronger sound of the rainfall. She slipped into the seat, and I noticed how she moved. It was almost too fluid, too graceful for someone who should have been stiff with cold. As she settled in, I cranked up the heat, hoping to help her warm up. The vents blasted hot air, quickly fogging up the windows. She mumbled a thank you, but otherwise didn't say much. I found myself studying her in the dim light of the dashboard. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her eyes, there was something off about them. They seemed to reflect the light strangely, like a cat's eyes might. We sat there for a moment in awkward silence, the only sound the rain hammering on the roof and the soft whoosh of the heater. I introduced myself and asked where she was headed. Her response was brief. She just needed to get to the next town. Her voice was soft, with an odd, echoing quality to it. I noticed she had a strange, almost vacant look in her eyes, but I chalked it up to exhaustion and being caught in the storm. Still, something about her gaze made me uneasy. It was as if she was looking through me rather than at me. As we started driving again, I tried to make small talk, asking about her story and how she ended up hitchhiking in such terrible weather. She gave vague answers, mentioning something about her car breaking down and her phone being dead. I didn't push too hard. Some people just aren't chatty, especially with strangers. But with each passing minute, the silence in the car grew more oppressive. broken only by the sound of the rain and the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, my knuckles turning white. The rain continued to pound against the windshield as we drove. The roads were slick, and I had to concentrate hard to keep us on track. The headlights barely penetrated the curtain of water in front of us, and more than once I felt the car hydroplane slightly, causing my heart to race. Every now and then I'd glance over at my passenger. She sat perfectly still, staring straight ahead, barely blinking. It was a bit unnerving, to be honest. Most people would be fidgeting, looking out the window or trying to make conversation. But not her. She was as motionless as a statue, save for the slight rise and fall of her chest as she breathed. I tried to focus on the road, but my mind kept wandering. Who was this woman? Why was she out here alone on such a terrible night? The more I thought about it, the more questions I had. Why weren't her clothes drying despite the heat blasting from the vents? And why did she seem so otherworldly? After about 20 minutes of driving, she suddenly spoke up, making me jump in my seat. Her voice seemed to come out of nowhere, breaking the tense silence that had fallen between us. She asked if I could drop her off at a gas station up ahead. I was a bit surprised. We were in the middle of nowhere, and I hadn't seen any signs for a gas station. But sure enough, as we rounded the next bend, I saw the dim lights of a small service station in the distance. The sight of the gas station was both a relief and a new source of unease. On one hand, it meant I could drop off my strange passenger and be on my way. On the other hand, how had she known it was there? We hadn't passed any signs, and in this weather you couldn't see more than a few yards ahead. It was as if she had some kind of sixth sense about the road. I pulled into the station, the tires splashing through deep puddles as we entered the dimly lit lot. Relief washed over me as I realized we'd made it safely through the worst of the storm. The rain had eased up a bit, and I could actually see more than a few feet ahead of me now. The gas station looked old and run down, with flickering fluorescent lights and rusty pumps. It seemed deserted, which wasn't surprising given the hour and the weather. I turned to my passenger to say goodbye, but to my shock, the seat was empty. For a moment, I just sat there, stunned. I hadn't heard the door open or close. There had been no sound, no movement, nothing to indicate she had left the car. How could she have gotten out without me noticing? It was impossible. My heart began to race, and I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, despite the warmth in the car. I looked around the parking lot, but there was no sign of her. It was like she'd vanished into thin air. The rain fell steadily, creating ripples in the puddles that reflected the flickering lights of the gas station. But there was no sign of my mysterious passenger. Feeling thoroughly confused and more than a little freaked out, I decided to go into the station to ask if anyone had seen her. Maybe she'd just been really quick and quiet about getting out of the car. Maybe I'd zoned out for a moment and missed her exit. I tried to rationalize what had happened, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. I got out of the car, the rain immediately soaking through my clothes. The air was cold and damp, and I shivered as I made my way to the station's entrance. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, the sound unnaturally loud in the quiet night. The clerk looked up from his magazine with a bored expression, clearly surprised to see a customer at this hour. The interior of the station was as rundown as the outside. Flickering fluorescent lights cast a sickly glow over shelves of dusty snacks and automotive supplies. The linoleum floor was cracked and stained, and there was a pervasive smell of stale coffee and cigarette smoke. I approached the counter, leaving a trail of wet footprints behind me. I asked the clerk if he'd seen a young woman come in. the one I'd just dropped off. He looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. After a moment, he shook his head and told me that I was the first customer he'd seen in hours. According to him, no one had been out there for days, let alone tonight in this weather. I described the woman to him, thinking maybe she'd come in when he wasn't looking. But he just shrugged and said he hadn't seen anyone matching that description. He suggested that maybe I was more tired than I realized and had imagined the whole thing. His words sent a chill down my spine. Had I imagined her? Was I so exhausted that I'd hallucinated an entire person? I left the store feeling thoroughly confused and more than a little freaked out. The rain had picked up again, and I ran back to my car, splashing through puddles. I got back in and just sat there for a while, trying to make sense of what had happened. The rhythmic sound of the rain on the roof was no longer soothing. Instead, it felt oppressive, almost menacing. As I sat there, I noticed something on the passenger seat, a small puddle of water. My heart started racing. That had to be from my passenger, right? But if she was real, where did she go? And why didn't the clerk see her? I reached out to touch the water, half expecting my hand to pass right through it. But it was real cold and wet against my fingertips. I decided to drive around the area a bit, thinking maybe she'd wandered off somewhere. But the roads around the gas station were empty, stretching out into the darkness in all directions. There was nowhere else she could have gone. No other buildings, no houses, nothing but miles of wet forest and empty highway. After about half an hour of fruitless searching, I gave up and decided to continue on my way to Astoria. As I drove, my mind kept replaying every detail of the encounter. The way she appeared so suddenly in the rain, her vague responses to my questions, the eerie stillness as she sat in my car, and then her impossible disappearance. None of it made sense. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe she had slipped out of the car while I was distracted by the rain and the difficult driving conditions. Maybe the clerk at the gas station had been so engrossed in his magazine that he genuinely didn't see her come in. But deep down, I knew these explanations didn't add up. The more I thought about it, the more unsettled I felt. There was something unnatural about the whole experience, something that defied logical explanation. I found myself wondering about the history of that stretch of road. Had other drivers experienced similar things? Were there stories of accidents or tragedies that might explain the presence of a mysterious hitchhiker? As I continued down the dark, rain-slicked highway, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd brushed up against something beyond my understanding. Several times, I thought I saw her again. A flash of pale skin in the darkness, or a flicker of movement just at the edge of my vision. But each time I looked more closely, there was nothing there. Just shadows and rain, and the endless stretch of empty road. As the miles ticked by, my mind raced with questions. Who was she? Where did she come from? And most importantly, where did she go? Was she some kind of ghost, doomed to repeat the same journey over and over, or was she something else entirely? Something my mind couldn't even begin to comprehend. I thought about the stories I'd heard as a kid about phantom hitchhikers and roads haunted by the spirits of those who had died there. I'd always dismissed them as silly campfire tales. But now I wasn't so sure. Had I somehow slipped into one of those stories without realizing it? But in the end, I was left with more questions than answers. The experience had shaken my understanding of reality, leaving me with a newfound appreciation for the mysteries that might be lurking just beyond our perception. It was a warm summer night in late July when I found myself driving along the seemingly endless stretch of Interstate 40 in New Mexico. I'd been on the road for nearly 14 hours, having left Los Angeles early that morning bound for Amarillo, Texas. The clock on my dashboard read 1:17 a.m., and the fatigue was really starting to set in. The landscape around me was a sea of darkness, broken only by the occasional flickering of my headlights catching the reflective road signs. The moon hung low in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desert landscape. I'd always loved long drives, but tonight the emptiness of the highway was starting to get to me. I just passed through Albuquerque about an hour ago, and the next major town, Tucumcari, was still a good ways off. My eyelids were getting heavy, and I knew I needed to take a break soon. Just as I was considering pulling over to the shoulder for a quick nap, I spotted a sign for an upcoming rest stop. It couldn't have come at a better time. As I took the exit, I noticed how deserted everything looked. The rest stop was just a small clearing off the highway with a few picnic tables, some vending machines, and a block of restrooms. There were no other cars in sight, which wasn't too surprising given the hour, but it still felt a bit unsettling. I pulled into a parking spot and cut the engine. The sudden silence was almost deafening after hours of road noise. I sat there for a moment, letting my eyes adjust to the darkness. The area was dimly lit by a few flickering street lamps casting long shadows across the empty parking lot. As I was about to get out of the car to stretch my legs, something caught my eye. At the far end of the parking lot, partially hidden in the shadows, was an old pickup truck. I hadn't noticed it when I first pulled in, and for a moment I wondered if I was seeing things. But no, it was definitely there. A beat-up old Ford, probably from the 80s, its paint job faded and peeling. I couldn't see anyone inside the truck from where I was parked, but something about it made me uneasy. Why would someone park all the way over there, hidden in the darkness, when the rest of the lot was empty? I debated for a moment whether I should just leave, but my need for a break and a bathroom won out over my paranoia. Cautiously, I opened my car door and stepped out. The warm night air hit me like a wave, and I could hear the chirping of crickets in the distance. I stretched, feeling my joints pop after hours of sitting. As I did, I glanced over at the truck again. That's when I saw him, the driver. He was sitting perfectly still in the cab, just staring straight ahead. Even from this distance, I could feel his eyes on me. A chill ran down my spine despite the warm night. I tried to act casual, walking towards the restrooms while keeping the truck in my peripheral vision. The whole time, the driver didn't move an inch. He just sat there, watching. I quickened my pace, suddenly very aware of how alone I was out here in the middle of nowhere. Once inside the restroom, I let out a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The fluorescent lights flickered and buzzed, and the place smelled of cheap disinfectant, but at least I felt a little safer with walls around me. I went about my business quickly, all the while straining my ears for any sound of footsteps or a car door opening. When I emerged from the restroom a few minutes later, my eyes immediately went to the spot where the truck had been parked. To my relief, it was still there, and the driver still seemed to be inside. I walked back to my car, trying to appear calm while my heart raced in my chest. As I reached for my car door handle, I heard it, the sound of an engine starting up. I whipped my head around to see the old truck's headlights flicker to life. Without thinking, I jumped into my car and locked the doors, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys. The truck began to move, slowly pulling out of its spot and heading towards the exit. As it passed by me, I caught a glimpse of the driver, a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard and a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look at me as he drove by, but I still felt a wave of relief as he pulled onto the highway and disappeared into the night. I sat there for a few more minutes, trying to calm my racing heart. Part of me felt silly for getting so worked up over nothing. After all, the guy hadn't actually done anything threatening. But another part of me, the part that had been raised on true crime stories and warnings about stranger danger, kept insisting that I'd narrowly avoided something sinister. Finally, feeling a bit more settled, I started up my car and pulled back onto the highway. The incident at the rest stop had left me wide awake, and I figured I might as well make the most of it and cover some more miles before stopping for the night. As I settled back into the rhythm of the road, my mind kept replaying the events at the rest stop. Had I overreacted? Or had my instincts potentially saved me from a dangerous situation? The more I thought about it, the more I convinced myself that something wasn't right about that truck and its driver. I'd been driving for about half an hour when I noticed headlights in my rearview mirror. At first, I didn't think much of it. This was a major interstate, after all. But as the minutes ticked by and the vehicle behind me maintained the same distance, a knot of unease began to form in my stomach. I tried to get a better look at the vehicle in my mirrors, but all I could make out were the headlights. It was too dark to see what kind of car it was, but a nagging voice in the back of my mind whispered that it could be the truck from the rest stop. Determined to shake off my paranoia, I decided to test my theory. I slowed down a bit, expecting the car behind me to pass, but it didn't. Instead, it slowed down too, maintaining the same distance. My heart started to race again. I sped up, pushing my car a little faster than I was comfortable with on the dark highway. The headlights behind me kept pace. I slowed down again, and so did they. It was clear now that whoever was behind me was deliberately following me. Panic started to set in. I was still miles away from the next town, and my cell phone showed no service. I considered pulling over and confronting whoever was following me, but the thought of facing that scruffy-faced man from the truck made me think twice. Instead, I decided to try and lose them. I spotted an exit coming up and made a split-second decision. Without signaling, I swerved onto the off-ramp at the last moment. In my rearview mirror, I saw the headlights behind me swerve as well, barely making the exit. The road I found myself on was a 2-lane highway winding through the desert. I pushed my speed up, taking the curves faster than was probably safe. The headlights behind me fell back a bit, but didn't disappear. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel as I navigated the unfamiliar road. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only about 15 minutes, I saw lights ahead. It was a small town, Santa Rosa, according to the welcome sign I flew past. I'd never been so happy to see civilization in my life. I slowed down as I entered the town, my eyes darting between the road ahead and my rearview mirror. The headlights were still there, but further back now. As I approached an intersection with a traffic light, I had an idea. The light was green as I approached, but I slowed down anyway. Just as I reached the intersection, the light turned yellow. I gunned the engine and shot through, watching in my mirror as the light turned red just as my pursuer reached it. Heart pounding, I took a series of random turns through the small town, not caring where I ended up as long as I lost the car behind me. After a few minutes of this, I finally allowed myself to believe that I'd shaken them off. I found myself on the main street of Santa Rosa, lined with small businesses and restaurants, all closed at this late hour. But up ahead, I saw the glowing sign of a 24-hour diner. It was like a beacon of hope in the darkness. I pulled into the diner's parking lot and cut the engine, but I didn't get out right away. Instead, I sat there, scanning the streets around me for any sign of the truck or the headlights that had been following me. But the streets were empty and quiet. Finally, feeling relatively safe, I got out of my car and hurried into the diner. The bell above the door jingled as I entered, and the smell of coffee and grease hit me like a wave. There were only a couple of other customers, a tired-looking trucker at the counter, and an elderly couple in a booth near the back. The waitress, a middle-aged woman with dyed red hair and a kind face, took one look at me and seemed to sense something was wrong. She asked if I was okay, her voice filled with genuine concern. I must have looked a real mess, sweating, shaking, and probably wild-eyed from fear and adrenaline. I collapsed into a booth, and when the waitress came over with a menu, I found myself spilling out the whole story. She listened patiently, refilling my coffee cup and offering sympathetic nods at all the right moments. When I finished, she assured me that I'd done the right thing by trusting my instincts and getting to a safe place. We were interrupted by the sound of a vehicle pulling into the parking lot. My heart leapt into my throat, and I'm sure all the color drained from my face. But it wasn't the old truck. It was a police cruiser just stopping by for the officer's regular coffee break, according to the waitress. Seeing my reaction, the waitress suggested I talk to the officer. At first, I was hesitant. After all, nothing had actually happened, and I was worried about looking foolish. But the waitress gently insisted, saying it was better to be safe than sorry. So I found myself recounting my story once again, this time to a patient but skeptical-looking police officer. He took notes and asked a few questions, but I could tell he wasn't entirely convinced. Still, he said he'd keep an eye out for the truck I described and suggested I stay in town for the night, just to be on the safe side. The waitress, overhearing this, mentioned that her brother owned a small motel just down the street. She offered to call and see if they had a vacancy. I gratefully accepted, suddenly realizing just how exhausted I was after the night's events. As I waited for the waitress to make the call, I couldn't help but replay the events of the night in my mind. Had I really been in danger, or had my tired mind blown everything out of proportion? Part of me felt silly for causing such a fuss, but another part insisted that something about that truck and its driver had been genuinely unsettling. The waitress returned with good news. Her brother had a room available and was even offering me a discounted rate after hearing my story. The police officer offered to follow me to the motel just to ensure I got there safely. I accepted both offers gratefully. As I settled into the small but clean motel room, I found myself jumping at every little sound. The events of the night had left me on edge, and even though I was exhausted, sleep seemed impossible. I kept replaying every detail in my mind, second-guessing my reactions and wondering if I'd overreacted. But as the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, I finally drifted off into an uneasy sleep. When I woke a few hours later, the events of the night before seemed almost like a dream. In the light of day, my fears seemed somewhat overblown. I checked out of the motel and stopped by the diner to thank the kind waitress before getting back on the road. As I merged onto the highway, heading east towards Amarillo, I kept a wary eye on my rearview mirror. But there was no sign of the old truck or any suspicious vehicles. The rest of my journey was uneventful, but the experience left a lasting impression on me. It made me more cautious about stopping at isolated rest areas, especially at night. In the end, I never found out if I was really in danger that night, or if it was all just a product of an overactive imagination fueled by fatigue and too many true crime podcasts. But the experience taught me to trust my instincts and to always err on the side of caution when traveling alone. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when I set out on what should have been a routine haul along US 2 in northern Michigan. I'd been driving trucks for nearly a decade, and this route through the dense forests of the Upper Peninsula was one I'd taken countless times before. The job was simple: transport a load of auto parts from Escanaba to Sault Ste. Marie. I left Escanaba around 2 p.m., figuring I'd make it to the Sioux by nightfall if traffic was light. The first couple hours of the drive were uneventful. The trees lining the highway were a patchwork of reds, oranges, and yellows, a beautiful sight that never got old no matter how many times I'd seen it. As the sun began to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the road, I noticed the temperature dropping. The cab of my truck was warm and comfortable, but I could see my breath fogging up the windows slightly. I switched on the radio, catching the tail end of a weather report. The forecaster was warning about an early cold snap moving in overnight. Great, I thought to myself, just what I need. Icy roads in October. I was about halfway to Sault Ste. Marie, just past Manistique, when things started to go wrong. At first it was just a slight shuddering in the engine, barely noticeable. But over the next few miles it grew worse. The truck began to lose power and I had to downshift to keep my speed up. I've had my share of mechanical issues over the years, but something about this felt different. The way the engine was sputtering and the odd smell coming through the vents made me think this wasn't just a simple breakdown. As the problem worsened, I started looking for a safe place to pull over. This stretch of US 2 was particularly remote, with dense forest on both sides and few signs of civilization. Just as I spotted a wide shoulder up ahead, the engine gave one final, violent shudder and died completely. I coasted to a stop on the shoulder, my hazard lights blinking feebly in the growing darkness. For a moment I just sat there, listening to the tick of the cooling engine and trying to process what had just happened. Then, with a sigh, I grabbed my flashlight and climbed out of the cab. The air outside was bitter cold, and I pulled my jacket tighter around me as I popped the hood. A cloud of steam greeted me, along with a strong smell of burning oil. Even in the fading light, I could tell this was more than a quick fix. I reached for my cell phone, only to be greeted by the dreaded "no service" message. Of course, I thought, frustrated but not surprised. Cell coverage was spotty at best out here in the boonies. As I stood there contemplating my next move, I heard the sound of an approaching vehicle. Hope surged through me. Maybe it was another trucker who could help, or at least call for a tow when they reached an area with cell service. But it wasn't a semi that rounded the bend. It was an old pickup truck, its paint faded and rusted in spots. The truck slowed as it approached, and I waved my flashlight, signaling for help. The pickup pulled over about 20 feet behind my truck. Two men got out, both dressed in worn flannel shirts and work boots. They looked to be in their late 40s or early 50s, with weathered faces that spoke of a life spent outdoors. As they approached, I felt a twinge of unease. Something about their body language seemed off. They weren't walking with the casual gait of good Samaritans coming to help. Their movements were too deliberate, too focused. Still, I pushed aside my concerns. I was a big guy, used to handling myself, and I needed help. I greeted them, explaining my situation and asking if they had a phone with service. The older of the two men, a guy with a salt and pepper beard, replied that they didn't have a phone, but they knew a bit about trucks. He offered to take a look at my engine, see if they could help get me back on the road. I hesitated for a moment, that nagging sense of unease growing stronger. But what choice did I have? I was stranded in the middle of nowhere with a dead truck and no way to call for help. Reluctantly, I agreed. The two men moved to the front of the truck, peering under the hood. They muttered to each other, pointing at various parts of the engine. I stood back, watching them work, trying to shake off my growing sense of dread. After a few minutes, the younger guy, a wiry fellow with a patchy mustache, called me over. He pointed to a part of the engine, explaining that it looked like my alternator had failed. He said they might be able to jury-rig a temporary fix, enough to get me to the next town. I nodded, relief starting to replace my earlier apprehension. Maybe I had misjudged these guys. They seemed to know what they were talking about, and they were offering to help. I started to feel a bit guilty for my initial suspicions. The older man asked if I had any tools in the truck. I did, a basic set in a compartment behind the cab. As I turned to go get them, I caught a glimpse of something that made my blood run cold. The younger guy was slipping something into his pocket, something that glinted in the beam of my flashlight. A knife. In that moment, everything clicked into place. The way they had approached, their overly casual offer of help, the prolonged inspection of my engine. They weren't here to help. They were stalling, waiting for the right moment to rob me. My mind raced, trying to figure out my next move. I was outnumbered and potentially outarmed. My truck was dead, so I couldn't just jump in and drive away. And even if I could outrun them on foot, where would I go? The forest was dark and unfamiliar, and I'd likely just end up lost. I decided my best bet was to play along for now. Look for an opportunity to turn the tables. I forced myself to act casual as I retrieved the toolbox from my truck. As I rummaged through it, I palmed a heavy wrench, slipping it into my jacket pocket as inconspicuously as I could. Returning to the front of the truck, I handed over the toolbox. The two men set to work, making a show of tinkering with the engine. I stood back, every muscle in my body tense, ready to react at a moment's notice. As they worked, the men kept up a steady stream of casual conversation, asking about my route, my cargo, how long I'd been driving. I answered vaguely, my mind racing to come up with a plan. After what felt like hours, but was probably only about 20 minutes, the older man straightened up, wiping his hands on his jeans. He turned to me with a smile that didn't reach his eyes, saying they'd done all they could, but the truck needed parts they didn't have. He suggested I come with them to the next town to get help. I knew this was the moment they'd been waiting for. Once they got me away from the relative safety of the highway, in the enclosed space of their truck, I'd be completely at their mercy. I pretended to consider their offer stalling for time. I asked how far the next town was, what kind of repair shops they had there. As I spoke, I slowly moved my hand towards my pocket, fingers closing around the wrench. The younger man was getting impatient. He took a step towards me, his hand moving towards his pocket. The pocket I'd seen him slip the knife into earlier. That was all the confirmation I needed. In one fluid motion, I pulled the wrench from my pocket and swung it in a wide arc. The heavy tool connected with the younger man's outstretched arm with a sickening crack. He howled in pain, the knife clattering to the asphalt. The older man lunged at me, but I was ready. I sidestepped his attack, bringing the wrench down on his shoulder. He stumbled, off balance, and I took the opportunity to land a solid punch to his jaw. For a moment, everything was chaos. The two men were shouting. I was yelling for help, even though I knew no one was likely to hear, and we all scrabbled for position on the narrow shoulder of the highway. In the midst of the scuffle, I heard a sound that made my heart leap, the rumble of an approaching engine. Headlights appeared around the bend, and I redoubled my efforts to break free from my attackers. As the vehicle, another semi-truck, drew closer, the two men seemed to realize their plan had fallen apart. The younger one, still clutching his injured arm, tugged at his partner's sleeve. They exchanged a quick glance, then turned and ran for their pickup. I watched, heart pounding, as they peeled out onto the highway, tires squealing. They sped off into the night, leaving me standing there, wrench still clutched in my shaking hand. The semi that had interrupted the attack pulled over, and a concerned-looking driver hopped out. He took in the scene. Me, disheveled and wild-eyed, standing next to my broken-down truck. and asked if I was okay. It took me a moment to find my voice. When I did, the whole story came spilling out. The breakdown, the suspicious helpers, the attempted robbery, and the fight. The other driver listened with wide eyes, then immediately got on his radio to call for help. Within an hour, the lonely stretch of US 2 was a hive of activity. State troopers had arrived to take my statement and search for any evidence the would-be robbers might have left behind. A tow truck was hooking up to my disabled semi, ready to haul it to the nearest repair shop. And I was sitting in the back of an ambulance, being checked over by a paramedic despite my insistence that I was fine. As the adrenaline wore off, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. I'd narrowly avoided a potentially deadly situation. If that other truck hadn't come along when it did, who knows how things might have turned out. The state troopers were particularly interested in my description of the two men and their pickup truck. Apparently, there had been a string of similar incidents along this stretch of highway over the past few months. Stranded motorists being robbed by seemingly helpful strangers. My experience fit the pattern perfectly. I spent the next several hours giving statements, first to the state police at the scene, then later at the station in Manistee. They took photos of my injuries, just some scrapes and bruises, thankfully, and had me look through books of mugshots to see if I could identify my attackers. I couldn't find an exact match, but I was able to help a sketch artist create rough portraits of the two men. By the time all the paperwork was done, it was well past midnight. The police offered to put me up in a local motel for the night, an offer I gladly accepted. I was exhausted, sore, and in no shape to deal with my truck or my interrupted delivery. As I lay in the motel bed that night, sleep eluded me. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the glint of the knife, felt the impact of the wrench in my hand. I kept replaying the events in my mind, second-guessing every decision I'd made. Should I have been more suspicious from the start? Should I have tried to flag down another vehicle instead of accepting their help? The what-ifs were endless. The next morning, still groggy from lack of sleep, I made my way to the repair shop where my truck had been towed. The news wasn't good. The engine damage was extensive, likely caused by some kind of sabotage rather than a natural breakdown. The mechanic pointed out where fuel lines had been deliberately nicked and wires frayed. It was clear that my breakdown had been carefully orchestrated by the two men who tried to rob me. This revelation sent a chill down my spine. The level of premeditation involved was frightening. These weren't just opportunistic thieves. They were calculated predators who had likely done this many times before. I called my dispatcher to explain the situation. To my relief, he was understanding, more concerned with my safety than the delayed delivery. He arranged for another driver to pick up my trailer and complete the run to Sault Ste. Marie, and told me to take a few days off while my truck was being repaired. Over the next couple of days, as I waited for my truck to be fixed, I found myself jumping at every sound, eyeing every stranger with suspicion. The incident had shaken me more than I wanted to admit. I'd always prided myself on being tough, on being able to handle whatever the road threw at me. But this experience had shown me just how vulnerable we all can be. I also couldn't stop thinking about other drivers who might fall victim to these predators. I decided to do something about it. I reached out to some trucking forums and social media groups, sharing my story as a warning to others. The response was overwhelming. Messages of support poured in, along with similar stories from other drivers who'd had close calls on the same stretch of road. By the time my truck was repaired and I was ready to get back on the road, my story had spread far and wide in the trucking community. Drivers were on high alert, watching out for the distinctive pickup truck and the two men I'd described. It felt good to know that my experience might help prevent someone else from going through the same thing. As I climbed back into my cab for the first time since the incident, I felt a mix of emotions. There was anxiety, certainly. The memory of that night was still fresh. But there was also determination. I wasn't going to let fear keep me from doing the job I loved. I fired up the engine, feeling the familiar rumble beneath me. As I pulled out onto US 2, heading east to complete the delivery I'd started days ago, I felt a sense of resolution. What happened to me was terrible, but I'd survived. I'd fought back. And now I was back on the road, a little wiser and a lot more cautious. Thank you for watching. If you found these stories gripping, don't forget to subscribe for more spine-tingling content. For another hair-raising tale, check out our suggested video. And if you're hungry for more eerie encounters, dive into our playlist featuring similar chilling narratives.